verses 5 through 13 are answering the question, what is the sign? But it's Jesus answering it from the negative. These aren't the signs you're looking for. Mark 13, okay? Very confusing passage. And we've been working through it this week, and I think we figured out how it flows, all right? Very, very important ideas here in Mark 13. Okay, so lots of confusing stuff going on in this passage. Very, very difficult to understand everything that's going on here. And it can get confusing to us as we try to work our way through it. But there are a few key interpretive ideas that I think will help you to work through what's going on here in Mark 13. The first key idea is look at the question that Jesus is answering. Okay? Jesus is answering a question that is related to verses 2 and verses 4 primarily. This is the question that his disciples ask. Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled? Okay? What are they referencing? They're referencing Jesus' statement in verse 2. Do you see all these great buildings? Replied Jesus. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Okay, so what's the key idea here? This is the question they're asking, and this question relates to what Jesus has already said. In conclusion, the majority of what Jesus talks about is going to be related to answering this question. When will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled? That's what he's trying to answer. Basically, the first thing we need to recognize is that he is talking first and foremost about the destruction of the temple. Okay? He's talking first and foremost about the destruction of the temple. A lot of people like to take a lot of the things we just read and try to read them way out into the future, into some future prophetic time. Some of these things may apply to the future, but we need to recognize that first and foremost, Jesus is answering their question about when these things are going to happen and what will be the sign they're about to be fulfilled. Okay, so we've got our first interpretive key, guys. What is our first interpretive key? That Jesus is trying to answer when the temple is going to be destroyed. What is the second thing that we need to recognize? The second thing we need to recognize is that there is now a pericope that is essentially set apart for us, that is all one continuous unit, all teaching on this same topic. It starts in verse 5, Jesus said to them, and it ends in verse 23. This is all one section. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. This is one pericope, one continuous unit where Jesus is talking about the entire same subject during this whole time. Okay? It starts with, Jesus said to them, and it ends with, be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. Everything that has to do with answering this question is contained in verses 5 to 23. Okay? So that's the next interpretive key. Jesus is trying to answer the question, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And then verses 5 to 23 contain that answer. Everything in 5 to 23 is Jesus answering the question, when is the temple going to be destroyed? Okay? Now, what does he go into from 5 to 13? 5 to 13 is trying to answer the question, when will the temple be destroyed? But what is he trying to answer? These aren't the signs you're looking for, okay? Watch out that no one deceives you. And he lists a bunch of signs that aren't the signs that the temple is going to be destroyed. That's what 5 to 13 is about. It's still on topic. It's still on task, okay? Hey, guys, I'm talking about when's the temple going to be destroyed? But verses 5 to 13 are the signs you're not looking for. These aren't the signs you're looking for. Why? The general idea is that these are things that God's people are going to have to wrestle with in all ages, okay? And you've got three primary ideas. First, you have deception. Antichrists, false Christs, false messiahs. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors, so that's the first one. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. So that's the first one. The second one is war and natural disaster. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen. The end is still to come. Hey guys, it's not to come yet, okay? What end? Again, we're still talking about the end of the temple, the end of the old era, okay? So that throws a lot of people off. The end is still to come. What's the subject he's on? The end of the era of Israel, the end of the temple being destroyed and God being done with that period of redemptive history, okay? And he's saying these aren't the signs. The end is still to come. It's not here yet. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginnings of birth pains. If you look through the Old Testament, there are many times that birth pains are talked about. Guess what it almost always refers to? The destruction of a major city. That's almost always what it refers to. When you look up birth pains in the Old Testament, I would encourage you to do this. It almost always refers to the destruction of a major city. And so Jesus is saying, look, these things are going to happen, but they're the beginnings of birth pains. The end is still to come. It's not here yet, okay? Then persecution is going to happen. You must be on guard. You're going to be handed over to local councils and flogged in synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations, okay? Now, again, the gospel being preached to all nations is not some cosmic every single nation that ever exists. This is the same concept that Paul's talking about when he says he wants to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. He means to Spain. He means the known world, okay? And so the gospel must be first preached to all nations before what? Before the temple is going to be destroyed and the old age is going to be completed. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand what to say. Just say whatever is given to you at the time. It is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Reminds us of Peter in Acts. Brother will betray brother to death, and father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. This is just the idea that some family members are going to be Christian and some not, and some are going to be turned into the authority by the non-believers in their family. It's going to happen. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Okay? So he's saying, look, this is just standard fare in the Christian age. None of these are indications that the temple is getting blown up. These aren't the sign you're looking for. And that idea of sign, singular, is important. Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that things are about to be fulfilled? There's only one sign, okay? It's singular. And Jesus tells them all of these to tell them these aren't the signs that the temple is going to be destroyed, guys. These aren't them, okay? It's going to feel like it's them, because crazy stuff is going on all around you, but these aren't the signs. How do you know these aren't the signs? Because we're looking for one sign, and I'm telling you, this is just going to happen because you're Christian. This is what happens to Christians. This is what happens when the birth pangs are occurring, okay? And so verses 5 through 13 are answering the question, what is the sign? But it's Jesus answering it from the negative. These aren't the signs you're looking for, okay? And then he shifts in verse 14 to the sign. This is the sign that you're looking for. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's the sign they're looking for. The abomination of desolation. All of these aren't the signs, but this is the sign. So Jesus is again telling them, these things, don't worry about. They're the beginning of birth pangs. The end hasn't come. Those aren't the signs, but this is the sign. The abomination that causes desolation, standing where it does not belong. Now the interpretation of this that I think is most fitting is there are several events that are happening around 68, 69 AD that are, in a sense, leading up to Rome sacking Jerusalem. And there are several events of people desecrating the temple. And you can kind of take your pick on which one it is. There are different ideas of, Judaistic zealots. There are different ideas of new high priests being named that weren't in the proper lineage. There are all sorts of ideas about what this abomination of desolation is. But needless to say, there were several events in terms of desecrating the temple that happened prior to 70 AD. And This abomination that causes desolation is not a new idea. This actually comes from the Old Testament. Because in a previous, when the first temple was sacked, there was also an abomination of desolation. And it was representative of things that defiled the temple. And so, you can take your pick almost of 68, 69 AD defilements of the second temple that are the abomination of desolation that indicates that 70 AD is almost here. Now remember, 5 through 23 are all a continuous unit, okay? Answering when the temple is destroyed. So now that we're in 14 to 23 are all discussing the destruction of the temple. Not any second coming ideas. They're all discussing the destruction of the temple. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down and enter the house or take anything out. Let no one go back to the field to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be for those in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter. Does anyone know historically what season it was when Jerusalem was sacked? Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Now, a lot of people don't like this super strong language, but the most important city in the history of God's plan of redemption is about to be destroyed. I think strong language is worthy of being used. And these are tying, of course, into Old Testament apocalyptic images. So it's not unreasonable to assume that this is talking about the sacking of Jerusalem, even though the language seems very strong. And it continues on. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. The Old Testament often talks about God delivering his people, cutting short the days, making them shorter so that his people might have some relief. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. So all of this tells you about how the temple is going to be sacked and destroyed. We love to read and import all of our modern day ideas into here, but that doesn't work. I know you're joking, but that doesn't work because of this. Look what Mark writes. Let the reader understand. He's writing to his readers. You know what I mean? Like, so they could have understanding. He doesn't mean us, guys. He does not mean us. I can tell you that much. I think this helps clarify. 14 to 23. Well, again, 5 to 23. When is the temple going to be destroyed? 5 to 13, not signs that it's going to be destroyed. 14 to 23, the sign it will be destroyed. The sign that you're looking for. Then, we have another transitional phrase. Be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time, but in those days following that distress, after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, following that distress, now we have these ideas, which seem to refer to the end times. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Now we have a discussion of end time stuff. Cool Blaze does bring up a good point. What I'm teaching here is partial preterism. Okay? Now, some have taken this to be full preterism. The idea that all of this stuff was fulfilled in AD 70, but I don't think so. I think at the end of 23, we have a transition. Jesus in verse 23, up to verse 23, is talking about the destruction of the temple. But then he changes. But in those days following that distress, now he begins to talk about end times in verses 24 to 27. And so there is no need to run to full preterism. The idea that Jesus had a spiritual return in AD 70 and he spiritually came and destroyed Jerusalem. You don't need to do any of that to make sense of this passage. All you have to recognize is that he's switching in verse 23 to verse 24, a different topic. DJ says, partial preterism is mostly how the church fathers saw it, correct? The Augustine stance. Cool Blaze says, yeah, just being facetious. I know you were, Cool Blaze, but I want to use it as a teaching opportunity. It's very important for people to recognize that. We're not just loading everything that happens in the book of Revelation into AD 70. But it's clear as day that this is the question that he's trying to answer. Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left upon another. Everyone will be thrown down, i.e. the temple will be destroyed and Jerusalem will be sacked. And the disciples say, tell us when will these things happen and what will be the sign they're about to be fulfilled. Not the sign, and then in those days following that distress. Now here's the part that mixes everybody up. But in those days, all this stuff, I think can refer to end time stuff. But in those days following that distress, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky. Heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. So this can be end time stuff. But here's what throws everyone off. Verses 28 to 31 now. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know the summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And so, verse 30. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Because of verse 30, people run to a full preteristic approach. They say, okay, verse 30 says, all these things will happen. Therefore, we have to do full preterism. I don't think so. Who put all this stuff down, guys? Mark wrote all of this, okay? And he is just gathering together a collection of what Jesus taught on this topic. We've also got Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke talk about these things as well. And so, when you start to piece it all together, I think it makes perfect sense if verses 28 and 31 were spoken by Jesus about verses 5 to 23. This is a reference to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but not of necessity a reference to verses 24 to 27. I know chronologically in the text, verse 30 follows after these verses, but I don't think you, of necessity, have to read that means that in verse 30, when Jesus says, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened, that he meant all of this. Mark is just writing down all of the things that surrounded Jesus' discussion at this point. I don't think chronologically Jesus, of necessity, had to speak these words after speaking these words. Does that make sense? Mark is putting the material together, and the order of the verses is not necessarily the inspired piece we need to be worried about. Tabitha says, I don't know why I hadn't thought of that. Exactly, and it feels, when you're thinking that way, it feels like you're not doing justice to the scriptures. We're taught to read them in a literal fashion. We're taught to read the scriptures in such a way that we're taking it seriously and trying to believe what it says. Yes, but that doesn't mean that Jesus spoke these words in exactly this order. If you go to Matthew and Luke, it contradicts that. It contradicts that. So you're left, I think, with two stances based upon the interpretation that I've read thus far. You're left either with, no, Jesus spoke these words in this order, meaning that verse 30 also includes verses 24 to 27. Therefore, full preterism has to be true. Or the interpretation I've put forth, that he didn't necessarily say verses 28 to 31 right after including all of this material. Therefore, verses 28 to 31 apply to everything he's primarily been talking about in this section, i.e. the destruction of the temple. And then he also, in his discussion with them, mentioned this is what is going to happen in the days after that. I think it makes perfect sense of the passage. All you have to do is take verses 28 to 31 and move them up to just after verse 23, and it makes perfect sense of everything that's going on. You don't have to jump through any weird hoops. You don't have to have Apache helicopters, and you don't have to have, flying locusts that are as big as, houses. So I think it makes perfect sense of the context. It's consistent with a grammatical, historical interpretation of the passage. It doesn't do any damage to the inspiration of the text. It doesn't do any damage to Mark. It doesn't do any damage to what Jesus said, and everything begins to fall into place. So that's how I approach the text. But like I said earlier, I think I figured Mark 13 out, and I think there's a couple key ideas. You need to recognize what verses 5 through 13 are talking about. You need to understand the question Jesus is answering. You need to recognize when he switches gears to talking about last days, and you need to realize that verses 28 to 31 likely applied to his discussion about the temple, but not to his other discussion here. And boom, everything falls right into place. Right into place. I'm not saying it's the only interpretation, but it's the one that makes the most sense to me. Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here. I hope you enjoyed that video. Likes and subscribes are always appreciated, and if you scroll down to the description, you can join our Twitch or our Discord, where we would love for you to plug into our community. Take care. God bless. Bye now.